In this video, we'll help you understand if a QTIP trust is right for your family. If you don't know who I am, my name is Chris Dime. I'm a certified financial planner out of Edmonds, Washington, and I specialize in working with folks to and through retirement. In the coursework of doing holistic financial planning with clients, one of the core areas we focus on is estate planning. Now, for most people, estate planning can pretty much be handled by way of things like wills, powers of attorney, healthcare directives, etc. However, as the net worth climbs and as the family dynamic gets a bit more complicated, there might come a time where some more advanced estate planning strategies could come into play. And a lot of times this is because the net worth is approaching certain federal exemption levels or state exemption levels, whereby any assets in excess of these exemption levels will pay some form of state or federal estate taxes, unless you plan ahead of time. In addition, as it pertains to blended families, for example, one of the biggest concerns as it pertains to estate planning is making sure that the surviving spouse is well taken care of, but then also ensuring that no matter what changes in their life, the original intended beneficiaries still receive their fair share of the estate. So in this video, we'll talk about how a QTIP trust can do just that. So let's jump in. So a quick refresher on estate taxes in general, as it pertains to married couples. When one spouse passes away, their share of the estate is going to be worth X amount of money. And if that amount of money exceeds either federal or state level exemptions, they could be subject to estate taxes, which ultimately just reduces how much can get passed on to whoever they want. On the federal level, if your assets today exceed $12.9 million, then you might be in jeopardy of paying some federal estate taxes. In 2026, we forecast that individual federal exemption to be closer to about $7 million, and your state might have its own state estate tax exemption to worry about. I'll link below to a map that'll let you identify if your state has a state level estate tax exemption to worry about, and if so, you're going to want to factor that in as we go through today's video. The good news is, if your assets currently or you forecast that they will never exceed either your state or the federal exemption levels, then you probably have nothing to worry about by way of estate taxes. You can do whatever you want with that property. You could theoretically give it all to your spouse, you could give it all to your kids, or you could give it all to someone for a temporary amount of time and then make sure that after that temporary amount of time or triggering event happens, the rest of that property goes to somebody else that you've already identified. That strategy is called giving someone terminable interest. Basically means they have an interest in the property for a certain amount of time, and then the property goes to somebody else that you've already decided will get the money. And this is totally fine to do and doesn't affect your estate taxes as long as you're underneath those exemption levels. But let's say you currently are, or you forecast quickly being over those exemption levels, again, either on the state or federal level. Then doing something like giving terminable interest to property to somebody would require a bit more nuance and planning, and that's where the QTIP trust comes in. So normally, if someone's going to pass away with assets above a particular exemption level, we'll just take Washington State to keep it simple. Washington State has a state level estate tax exemption individually of $2.2 million per spouse. So if I die with less than $2.2 million in assets, I can do whatever I want with the money. If I think I'm going to die with a share of the estate worth larger than $2.2 million, I'm going to want to factor in some of these more nuanced strategies. One of the strategies that people will implement when their share of the assets are going to exceed a particular exemption level is the bypass trust. I'll link up here to my previous video on bypass trust to break it all down, but just to keep it very simple, what a bypass trust will do is it'll move out of your estate the dollar amount equivalent of the exemption. So theoretically, if I die with $5 million to my name, in Washington State, I would leave $2.2 million into a bypass trust. So theoretically, that would leave $2.8 million bucks of my estate left over to do something with. I could give it all to a friend and probably pay some Washington State estate taxes on that $2.8 million, or I could give it all to my wife. And if I do that, that qualifies under the unlimited marital deduction. So then nobody would owe any estate taxes upon my death by doing that. Keep in mind, all the money that I put into the bypass trust, my spouse could still access after I'm gone by way of the HEMS provision, or health, education, maintenance, and support. Basically, if she needs money, she is entitled to get some money out of the bypass trust just to make sure she isn't going destitute. Now, with that $2.8 million, what if I wanted to do something like we talked about before, where maybe I give my wife access to the $2.8 million for a certain amount of time, and then I have the rest go to my friend that I wanted as an original beneficiary. I want to make sure my wife's well taken care of, but at the same token too, when she's gone, I want to make sure that somebody else gets this money, and I don't want her changing who gets that money or not. Because theoretically, if I just gave all this money to her as an outright unlimited marital deduction, she could change who the beneficiary is of that property whenever she wants to, and I'd have no control because I'm dead. Now, this normally wouldn't be too big of a problem, especially if, you and your surviving spouse had a great relationship and all the beneficiaries are agreed upon ahead of time. However, in situations where maybe there's lots of different kids out there and maybe it's a blended family with kiddos from, different families that may or may not have all their own dynamics of communication and relationship status and things like that, it might make sense just to take all the guesswork out of it and provide my wife with lifetime access to a particular amount of property's income. And then when she passes away, the original beneficiaries that I wanted that money to go to when she's gone will for sure get that property. And you can do this by way of a QTIP trust. Now, I know what you might be thinking. What, you don't trust the surviving spouse to provide for the people that you originally wanted to provide for? And the shorter answer is you could say, no, I don't trust them. But in reality, there's a lot more nuance that could happen. For example, my surviving spouse could remarry, she could have a falling out with somebody. There could be some fraud that decreases the access to certain assets if I don't protect them inside of a trust. There's a lot that could happen that would ultimately just result in the beneficiaries being disinherited from a certain amount of money or assets that I wanted them to have. In addition to, if the beneficiaries, we'll say my kids from a previous marriage, aren't confident that they're going to get access to this wealth, that could change how they decide to run and operate their lives. Whereas if everybody knew that there was a QTIP set up, my wife knew she was going to be well taken care of after I'm long gone, and my first kiddos understood that they're going to be coming into X amount of assets no matter who she does or doesn't have a falling out with, that's going to provide them with a lot more peace of mind. And so it's a bit more nuanced than just, do you trust your spouse or not? There's other things like peace of mind that would be generated through the implementation of a QTIP trust after I'm dead. Now, normally giving somebody temporary access to some property and then already having dictated what happens to that property upon their death would not be considered part of an unlimited marital deduction. However, by use of a QTIP trust, it is. And a QTIP trust stands for Qualified Terminable Interest Property Trust, which is a bit of a mouthful, but it refers to the terminable interest we talked about, which normally would not classify as an unlimited marital deduction transfer. The QTIP trust allows for X amount of property to be transferred over to the spouse so that he or she can access income from the trust. However, you've already dictated who will get that trust corpus or principal upon the death of that spouse. This also means that since it does qualify as an unlimited marital deduction, that there are no estate taxes owed upon the first spouse's death. There are estate taxes owed, however, upon the death of the second spouse. In addition, during the survivorship of that second spouse, any income that's produced from the QTIP trust, any assets inside the QTIP trust that produce income, will go to the surviving spouse, and he or she will need to pay income taxes on that income generated from the trust. In addition, if there's property inside the trust that maybe isn't producing a bunch of income and the spouse does want the trustee to do so, he or she can instruct the trustee to turn some of the assets into income, kind of like how we send income to clients from their investment portfolios. Same situation. They can sell some non-income producing assets, stocks and bonds for example, and turn that into income producing assets. They're also a lot of times permitted to dip into the trust principal by way of that HEMS provision we talked about earlier. Again, health, education, maintenance, and support, ensuring that the surviving spouse doesn't become destitute. Outside of that, everything else in the QTIP trust goes to the original beneficiaries that the first spouse decided they wanted it to go to upon the death of the surviving spouse. The election for QTIP trust treatment to ensure that the IRS doesn't see this as just a terminable interest transfer, which again would still be considered estate taxable. To ensure it qualifies for the unlimited marital deduction, the executor will make a QTIP trust election on the estate tax return on Form 706. So calls to action wise, well, number one, I'd run a net worth projection to see if today or in the next decade or so, you'll be flirting with some of those exemption levels, either on the state or federal level. If you forecast that you currently are or soon will be in jeopardy of paying some state level or federal estate taxes, it's probably going to be in your best interest to speak to your financial planner and enlist the help of a competent estate planning attorney to help you strategize around the best ways to have your wealth get maximized to whoever it is you want it to go to, while not jeopardizing other people that you care about as well. In addition, if your family dynamic is a bit complicated, it might make sense to ask your estate planning attorney about a QTIP trust to see if it's efficacious relative to your goals of providing for your surviving spouse, but then at the same time dictating where the rest of that money will go once your surviving spouse passes away. So hopefully that was helpful in breaking down a QTIP trust. If you have further questions, drop them in the comments below or get in touch on the website. We'll get you squared away. Have an awesome rest of the week. We'll chat with you later. Bye.